It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, September 29th. Sam Park and John Ramey with you, and all-labor edition of Working for Crusoe. We have an expansion yet again of the United Auto Workers strike against the big three American automakers. The Writers Guild has ended their 148-day work stoppage with the movie and TV studios in Hollywood. SAG-AFTRA are meeting with the same movie and TV studios next week to work on their strike, which has been going on since May. Sam, the expansion of the United Auto Workers strike does not call for additional stoppages and walkouts at Stellantis, our favorite name of the parent company of Chrysler, but they are looking to expand it against facilities for Ford and General Motors.
See, that's odd to me, because if I worked at a company called Stellantis, I would want to be on strike every day. But we can, that's probably not one of their main issues, actually.
Okay, so there are the specific strikes, and those are kind of the biggest ones grabbing headlines this week. But there was a good article about the labor movement in kind of recent history in The Atlantic this week. Public approval of unions highest it's been in decades. Gallup took a poll last month, and union approval rating is now at 67%. It actually had been up to 71% last year, and that is way up from what it was 48% back in 2009, right?
Yeah, that's a dramatic increase.
3/4 of people responding to this Gallup poll said they sided with the auto workers against management, and the support for the striking television writers and their now concluded strike was nearly as high. 61% of people said unions help rather than hurt the economy. And to zoom out just a little bit further, and you will remember this, but I will not. President Ronald Reagan fired 11,000 union air traffic controllers in 1981. The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, PATCO.
Yeah, it was basically the first thing he did after becoming president. And regardless of whether you like or dislike Ronald Reagan, people still talk about that to this day. It really set the tone for his presidency and the real political transformation of the country that he effected while president.
So there is a doctoral candidate at Cornell University working in the Labor Action Tracker. His name is Johnny Callis, and he said that firing that you're describing in 1981 as his kind of initial salvo as president set the tone for a dramatic contraction of organized labor in the United States.
That's absolutely right.
Since then.
And speaking of things that I'll remember and you won't, when I was a small child, there were still commercials on television produced by and purchased on television by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And they sang a song saying, "So always look for the union label. It says we're able to make it in the USA." Now, John, I don't know exactly what you recall, but I bet you've never seen a commercial on national television paid for by a labor union.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, I mean, and now it's not like this was, one of the most frequently seen commercials at the time, but the point is that unions were much more powerful and well-regarded when I was very young than they have been almost any time since.
So Cornell is tracking. They have the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. They started tracking work stoppages recently, not so long ago. And this year, there have been 291 strikes involving 367,600 workers. And the assertion is from Johnny Callis that this might be a reverse PATCO moment, and certainly folding in the UAW and the two Hollywood strikes, that kind of fits that narrative. Now, I think it's obviously too early to tell. And also, this is not a political podcast, but when it comes to labor in the United States, there are very clearly drawn political lines, including President Biden visiting the picket line with the United Auto Workers this week. Former President Trump visited some picketing workers in Michigan, I believe, as well.
Yes, he spoke. I think he made two different appearances in Michigan. on Wednesday and Thursday, if I'm not mistaken.
President Trump, former President Trump, not nearly as overtly pro-labor as current President Joe Biden.
Well, the thing is, he says he is, but
the policies.
He also is openly antagonistic to the UAW leadership, and it's mutual, by the way. And I should add also that there have been other strikes that were averted. Right, the Teamsters were going to go on strike against UPS, but they came to terms in the 11th hour, and so that strike never actually happened. And I think you're right. It might be too early to say whether this is a complete reversal in our society. But again, as you mentioned, the opinion polls have really gone in the union direction very recently. I think part of it is due to the pandemic, frankly, because people on the lower ends of the income scale, they were working every day. I mean, almost the only place I ever went was the supermarket. All those people were still working every day, exposing themselves to COVID-19 every day. And so it was so obvious that people, again, at that level of the income scale, were bearing the brunt of the suffering for little to no compensation.
We actually had a word for it: essential workers.
Right.
And I think the economy is waking up to the concept of, well, if we're so essential, then we should be paid like we are.
Yes. Right. And the problem, though, is that people after the pandemic wanted to get back to normal, quote unquote. Right. And, those essential workers are like, Right? I mean, normal wasn't cutting it for us. And so and I think that thinking about it that way, it's easier to see why that position could have some public support.
I also, and again, I don't want to hammer politics and United States domestic politics, but I do think in particular when it comes to labor and political identification in this country, so much of the Trump populism MAGA movement is this hagiographic make America great again like it used to be. And they have this nostalgic projection of some fuzzy time in the post-war 1950s, 1960s, where non-college educated people had a path to the middle class due to the industrial base, right? There were plenty of ways for blue-collar workers to own a home and send their kids to college, right? What is missing in that, again, hagiography is that was because unions were extremely powerful and protected the wages of working people, right? They don't talk about that.
And well, I remember when Trump was first running, and just as an aside, this podcast deals with economics and international relations, right? Now, again, it's not a domestic politics podcast, so we shouldn't want it to be. But both of those topics are, essentially political in nature, or at least in part. So we shouldn't, think that we have to avoid talking about politics like the plague. But I remember when Trump was first running, many people thought that he shared appeal with Bernie Sanders, right? That there was an overlap with,
the horseshoe, I believe we called it, right?
Yeah, right. And you could see interviews with regular voters saying the people I support the most are Trump and Bernie Sanders. And if you listen to Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, his rhetoric is highly reminiscent of Bernie Sanders, and he exhibits what we might call a great degree of message discipline, which is a nice way of saying he says the same thing every time you talk to him. But it's all declamations against the billionaire class. Corporate greed, right? He literally says those two things in every single interview, along with economic and social justice. But again, we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. It's not so much that Sean Fain sounds like Bernie Sanders. It's that Bernie Sanders always sounded like an old-time union boss. And so these things, there's some indication, as you say, that perhaps, I don't like to use the pendulum metaphor because I think it's misplaced, but the momentum might be swinging back towards the labor side of the economic equation.
I also don't love the pendulum equation because, of course, a pendulum has to be affixed on one side to something. And I don't see that right now.
Well, not just that, but I mean, it moves of its own accord, right? I mean, these things happen because people do things, right? And that's not how pendulums really operate.
So the UAW, let's start there. 15-day strike started 2 Fridays ago, and they've had one expansion last week and now another expansion today. This strike, and I didn't connect the dots on this initially, but this strike is more or less, you can correct me if I'm wrong, more or less about getting back some of the concessions the United Auto Workers were forced to make during the global recession.
Yes, that's right.
Right. They had no leverage because unemployment was so high. And 2 of the big 3 declared for bankruptcy. And President Obama at that time was trying to save the American auto industry. And I think there was political pressure for the workers to play ball.
Yes, that's right. And they did. And that is, I think, one of the and Sean Fain, again, he talks about that in every interview also, right? That the taxpayers and the auto workers helped save the auto industry, and now the executives and shareholders of the big 3 are the ones reaping all the gains, and it's simply not fair. And it's difficult to argue against that, and except that, and this is true in many of the industries that are experiencing labor action. The executives of these industries don't seem to understand the world that they're living in. And then they seem to think that everybody just agrees that they should get all the money, right? I mean, it's just because that's the way it's been happening for so many years. I think it was on the eve of the strike, or perhaps in the early days of the strike, the General Motors CEO, Mary Barra, was being interviewed. I can't remember which outlet was doing the interview. But the interviewer asked her about her industry-leading $29 million compensation package. Right?
Fair question.
Yes. And she said, well, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, right? But first she said, well, only $2 million of that is my salary, right? The rest is all performance bonus. And of course she was excoriated for saying this. I found it curious, actually, that most people focused on her admittedly, shall we say, inartful use of the word only to describe her $2 million salary, right? And again,
I would also say that's an inartful characterization.
Yes, and so that's what most people focused on, was her saying, I only make $2 million in salary. But I honestly thought the more remarkable part was the non-salary part of her compensation, because that's her performance bonus, right?
Let's translate what performance for an executive means.
That's right. It's corporate profitability.
Right, which means squeezing the most efficiency at the lowest cost out of the labor force.
Well, in part, anyway, right? That's one of the ways your company can become more profitable, right? If you let's just say that if your workers were being paid more, your company would probably be less profitable. And in that case, your $27 million performance bonus might be a little smaller. And so it's just shocking that anyone would say this, right? And without, when your company is on the verge of a strike.
I mean, it does speak to how economically insulated what we refer to as the 1%, but I don't think that's a great term, but you know what I'm saying, right? The economically elite are so ensconced.
$29 million, that's probably down into the 10%, actually, right? I mean, I don't think she's in the 1%.
Yeah, that is shocking. Okay, so UAW, 2 Fridays ago, 12,700 members stopped working. A week ago, it added a series of 38 parts and distribution centers to the strike. And then as we record this on Friday, September 29th, there will now be more than 25,000 United Auto Workers on strike, with 7,000 more members striking against Ford and General Motors, but again, not Stellantis. Now, I am not a labor historian. I have read Howard Zinn's book, but I don't recall anywhere there were these phased ratcheting up of the tension strikes. Is this a new tactic? Because it seems awfully, it seems pretty shrewd.
That's an excellent point. And let's back up a little bit, because obviously Sean Fain doesn't run the UAW by himself. He has, negotiating teams of working with each of the big three, et cetera, right? He's not the sole leader of the UAW. So when we talk about Sean Fain, at least in terms of the negotiations with the big three, we're really talking about a whole team of people. But it's worth looking at Fain individually and his role in this whole process. Fain is the first directly elected president of the UAW. I guess they must have previously had some sort of electoral college or something like that, right?
Or some Senate that voted.
Yeah, or the shop stewards would vote or something like this, right? But so he was elected this year by the actual members of the UAW, narrowly, from what I gather, 50 some odd percent, but a clear victory. He also, I heard, was the first UAW president who's actually visited every shop floor. This was also surprising. I would have thought that this was just something you would do if you were the UAW president, right? So it's, again, both of these things, the previously indirect elections and never, the UAW presidents never visited every shop floor. It seems to have been more of a top-down sort of organization in the past than it is today. So first of all, just in becoming president and being president without a strike, Fain is a historically distinctive character as UAW president. And as you say, this the sort of graduated and accelerating pace of labor action in the case of this particular strike, that is also new, as is the strike against all three of the big three at the same time, which has also never happened before. I read in The Economist, from last week's Economist, that is, that generally what the UAW would do is strike one company and then reach an agreement with them, and the other two would fall in line with that agreement. And so in this strike, Fain has already become a historic figure inside of the UAW. And what he's been able to do, I think, is it's fascinating to me, right? Because if you're only striking one company, right, it's the union against the company, one-on-one. If you're striking all three, you're striking three companies that compete with each other. And the union is positioning itself as the arbiter of benefits, as what happened last week, right? He accelerated he announced additional actions against GM and Stellantis, but not against Ford.
Right, because they were making progress with Ford.
Yes, because he said Ford has demonstrated a seriousness about coming to an agreement, and the other two have not.
I mean, and this, unfortunately, will align with a disparaging narrative critical of labor unions, but that's kind of a gangster move.
Yes,
and very effective.
He's, in effect, pitting the big three against one another.
I mean, it is okay. So yes, it's unprecedented in modern labor history.
But why? I mean, you would have thought somebody would have thought about this earlier.
Well, I'll tell you why. It goes back to, you would have thought somebody would have visited every shop.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
And it used to be more of a top-down organization, we can only surmise, right? And we're talking exclusively about the United Auto Workers. But really what we're talking about, and I've been in a couple unions, is that, the knock on unions has always been that they're not particularly well run often. And sometimes outright corrupt.
Sure.
So, it is kind of fascinating. And again, you and I have hired people. We have been management, right? We've hired musicians, or I've hired media professionals for broadcasts or whatever.
Sure.
I've also been in a union, and I've also unionized a previously non-union seat at a newsroom I used to work at. It's bureaucratic and Byzantine and everything you can imagine. It's nothing like being, the leader of a band or a small business, right? It's the opposite, and it can be very frustrating. And you can see how so many people, if they had a brief encounter with a union at some point in their professional careers, concluded that it was, bupkis, right? It's just chopped liver. It's not good, right?
Yeah.
So it is refreshing. And I say this as a working person. I would like to maintain some objectivity because I'm not insensitive to what the auto workers are trying to do, which is stay competitive in a fiercely competitive global market without American unions as their, labor force. But it is refreshing to see a union be so effectively led and so effective in a negotiation.
That's right. And Sean Fain, in all these regards, he's not your father's union leader, but he acts like he is, right? He's from Indiana. He's got a Hoosier accent, right? He, wears the company polo, the UAW polo shirt, right? And he comes across very old school, but his tactics, I think, are very modern, right? To return to this sort of graduated escalation of action, right? Last week, as we recall and have mentioned, he announced additional actions against General Motors and Stellantis, but not against Ford, right? Because Ford had demonstrated a serious.
They were playing ball.
Yeah. And what I found interesting about that is that he didn't give Ford anything back that he had taken away from them. He just agreed not to escalate actions against them any further. So he got concessions out of Ford and gave them nothing in return publicly. And I thought, I was like, this guy's brilliant. But again, I think this is a function of going against all of the big three at the same time, right? Just that by itself changes the entire calculation of the game. And I think that that will go down in history as a real dramatic shift in the UAW's tactics. Again, I don't know why nobody ever did it before, because it would seem to be kind of basic game theory, right? But that's the way it's worked out. And so now, I don't know if you read the article about how what exactly the provisional agreements were with Ford last week. There were very minor moves on pay tiers, for example, right? You don't, you only have to work 90 days to go up from temp status to full-time status. And so that's
reasonable. Yeah, that's reasonable.
90 days.
I've done that at a job.
Sure. Right. And there's a cost of living or a COLA increase, as they say, right? Again, these are minor movements on pay. There's also the right to strike in any facility that's experiencing layoffs. This feels to me like just a sort of ratification of the leverage of the union, right? Saying this is how we negotiate. We need to have this written in, our right to strike. We would probably strike anyway, even if you didn't put it in there. We just want to have it in there. And then there was an income guarantee for laid off workers. Now, I haven't been able to suss out exactly what this is, right? It's at least a 2-year guarantee of sustained healthcare benefits, but I think it's also a sustained actual cash income after you've been laid off. So there's the right to strike if you're facility experiences layoffs, and there's some sort of compensation for if you are laid off. The point I want to make about this is that this seems to be a concession by the UAW, not to Ford, but to reality, right? Because everybody says, well, electric cars, if the whole industry moves toward electrification, will not need as much labor. And so, in a way, it seems like the UAW is conceding up front. Yeah, we get it. A bunch of us are going to lose our jobs, but the ones who do need to be taken care of. And so this is sort of similar to the situations we discussed earlier this year about inflation and interest rates, in which we mentioned that there's generations worth of financial professionals and financial journalists who've never seen inflation anywhere near this high in their lives, and consequently have never seen the Federal Reserve raise interest rates quite so quickly to combat inflation. As we were discussing today, unions have been such a weak institution in this country for such a long time, again, going back to the Reagan era, that journalists don't really understand how to even think or talk about them on a certain level. And for example, in the interview right at the beginning of the strike with Margaret Brennan, alone amongst American journalists practically to be interviewing Sean Fain, she asked him, well, electric cars are only going to require about 60% as much labor as internal combustion engine cars. And she seemed to think that this undercut Fain somehow. And of course, Sean Fain doesn't want to step up and say, yeah, there's going to be lots of layoffs, right? You can't really say that if you're the union boss, right? But of course he knows this. And his in all the interviews he's done since then, which have been many, right? As soon as Biden announced that he was going to visit the picket line, suddenly everybody wanted to interview Sean Fain. And as I said before, Fain says the same thing every time, right? And so he says, we want a green economy, but it can't be built on the backs of the working class. And so it seems as though the first agreements he came to with any of the big three were how to deal with layoffs. And I just think that's fascinating also, right? He seems to be very far-sighted. He knows that layoffs are coming, and he wants to make sure his people are taken care of. But when people ask him about the reduced labor that will be required for electric cars, they seem to think it's a gotcha question. And he's sitting there basically going, look, the big three needs our labor today and won't need it tomorrow. Why should we not use the leverage we have today while we have it? Should we just sit here and not ask for additional pay? How stupid do you think we are?
And again, that goes back to possibly ownership, management might think they're very stupid or just not consider them much because they're in such an insulated reality, as evidenced by the head of GM's inartful articulation of her salary structure.
Again, it's just like, what? We have this leverage today. We're not going to have it tomorrow. We're going to use it today. Is this really so? It's like, oh, but there's going to be layoffs. Yeah, that's right. There are going to be layoffs. That's why we're doing this.
You mentioned how it is unprecedented to be striking with all three of the big automakers at the same time for the UAW. It's also unprecedented in Hollywood for the Writers Guild and SAG, or now SAG-AFTRA, to be on strike at the same time against the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And the Writers Guild strike wrapped up this week, 148 days. They announced Tuesday they would end the strike. The details, you can't use AI to write or rewrite literary material, and the studios can't enforce writers to use AI, but writers can choose to use AI to aid their writing upon receiving consent from the same studios. Seems reasonable, right?
Sure.
There's also increased compensation for writers, new minimum staffing requirements for TV writers based on their episode count, essentially, within the Writers Guild and the agreements with TV and movie studios, especially TV, because it's changed so much how TV is produced, you would have a couple senior people kind of in that elevated tier, and then you'd have a bunch of junior people who weren't making very much money at all. And the nature of writing for television is, you don't know how long a show is going to go. You've got to reap all you can in the harvest season, and then hope you have enough until you get another gig. And television has never been more consumed than it is now, right? There's more television. There's more good television. It is supplanted movies in some sense as a cultural force. And essentially you can consume cinema quality television now because of the digital streaming platforms that live rent free in all of our heads, most of our heads.
How inexpensive the technology is.
Sure. The plight of the writers was real because they were now generating a product, similar to the auto workers or any worker, right? I am now contributing to an incredibly powerful wealth generator, and I'm not getting enough of a cut. So that's the resolution with the WGA. And then SAG-AFTRA, Screen Actors Guild, which merged with AFTRA maybe a decade ago. AFTRA is like the radio and television
that's the American. Guild. It's the American Federation of Television and Radio Announcers.
Yeah. So my father, my brother, and I have all been in that union.
Of course.
And
you better be.
Right. Well, but I'm not now. No, right. But when we it's various times worked for CBS News, that's a union shop, right? That's Writers Guild and AFTRA. Yeah. They will go back to the table this week. So one strike is done in Hollywood, but coming back to striking with all three in Detroit, 2 simultaneous strikes. It's kind of the inverse in Hollywood, right? But there is strength in numbers. Yeah,
absolutely. And the Teamsters almost struck, right? The hospitality workers of 3 different casino companies in Vegas might be striking very soon. There's a word perhaps of Kaiser going on strike, the healthcare provider.
Yes, I did hear a report on NPR about that. And that, that's a tough one, right? People can go without new cars. It's a tougher needle to thread when you're telling the public at large you can't get a doctor's appointment right now.
That's right. And again, during the pandemic, right, people were banging their pots and pans and saying healthcare workers are heroes. It didn't actually take very long for some of those healthcare workers to stand up and say, you know what? We don't want to be heroes. We want to be treated fairly. All right. If calling us heroes, if you think that's a substitute for actually paying us a decent wage, you're wrong.
Right. Okay? I've never paid my rent and you banging your pot and pan.
Exactly. Right. And so, again, maybe this strike will be averted. Maybe it won't. But it seems like this is sort of ramping up. And it's difficult to see what, again, people talk about the Reagan firing of the air traffic controllers as a seminal political moment in his presidency. I think it's difficult to foresee what the political impact of all this labor action might actually be. Again, President Biden says he's the most pro-union president in history, and he proved it by standing next to Sean Fain on the picket line this week and saying, stick with it, right? Not something reasonable like, I hope the strike can be brought to an end quickly. He said, stick with it.
Yeah, he said you deserve to be paid more.
Yes. And so hope this might, he of course imagines that this will redound to his political benefit. We'll see if it actually does. I think it might. But this could be such a large change in our society that it would be difficult to foresee exactly what the impact could be. We use the terms like unprecedented and uncharted territory so frequently, and that's for good reason, right? But if we're in uncharted territory, then quit trying to tell me what's going to happen, right? Just draw the chart. Right. Just of where you are. Right. Okay, fine. Maybe if you can see the hills ahead of you, you can tell me about the hills. Right. But I know perfectly well that you can't see past the hills. So don't try to tell me what's on the other side. All right. Just give me a good map of the hills.
For next week, what are you looking at?
You know what? There's going to be snap elections in Slovakia tomorrow.
Hey!
Which I just found out about the other night.
And I just found out right now.
Well, that's why they're called snap elections, though. It's not because they have.
Could you imagine the American media complex, the media industrial complex, if we had snap elections?
It would be so awesome.
It would be like the NFL on LSD. It would be unbelievable.
But we're not going to be that fortunate. So I know very little about the snap elections coming up in Slovakia. But there was a very good segment on the PBS NewsHour 2 nights ago. That is Wednesday, towards the end of the program. So you can hunt that up on YouTube. Spoiler alert: the far right populist candidate is expected to do very well. So that's the only thing I'm aware of coming up next week. But I'm sure there will be more developments about the UAW and possibly
Screen Actors Guild-AFTRA.
Exactly right. I mean, and any number of other labor actions could be taking place also, which I'm happy that we've been able to take a deep dive into today, because I think it's going to be more important as time goes on.
Okay. Comments, questions, suggestions, compliments, johnrameymedia@gmail.com. For Sam Park, I am John Ramey. This has been Working for Crusoe. Have yourselves a fine weekend.
Bye, everybody.